Movies go out of their way to give us as much as possible for our money. But in the process of doing that, they can make decisions that don't actually work the best for us. Usually that gets solved when the movies aren't successful, and the mistake doesn't get repeated. But sometimes, movies end up doing things that actually make money, but upset people at the same time. And the best example is probably the films of Michael Bay. No one can question that his movies have made billions of dollars, but at the same time, critics and a lot of fans love to bash him. And everyone can see that he likes to blow things up constantly, and the acting isn't always the best.
You gonna talk now?
But I think the thought process behind those decisions and how they affect us can lead us to a lot more interesting things. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because Michael Bay isn't the only filmmaker that does things in that all-action style, and there actually is a reason behind it. That is, trying to give you a good time. After all, a lot of very successful franchises feature explosions and action-packed moments, but normally these things are limited to the climax of the movie. Now, the climax is actually the part where we feel the strongest emotions, and as a result, the part we remember the most.
The only thing that matters is the ending. It's the most important part of the story, the ending.
So naturally, if you're thinking about how to give people the best experience, then you might decide to simply give them a movie that is one long climax. Then it's just the good part, right? Well, unfortunately, our minds aren't that simple, because we do feel the strongest emotions at the climax of the movie, but it's not only because of the climax. Those emotions are actually set up by everything that happens before we get there. You see, there's a lot of different good feelings that we can have, and some are there for short-term things, like energizing us to react to surprises.
Your grandparents are downstairs.
Or making us want to pay attention to something that may be important. But those short-term emotions drain just as quickly as they show up, because they're attached to things that may not actually help us that much. So it doesn't serve us to feel so good from them that we pursue them over other things. But there are a set of powerful emotions that do help us much more, and those tend to give us longer-lasting good feelings, to make us seek out those situations and remember them, so we can use them in the future. And in general terms, those are things that either improve our position in the world, allowing us to understand things better or survive more easily, or things that solidify our position, that underline what we already have or strengthen our standing. And these work in a very special way. They actually build up over time. We see a situation that may provide new information that helps us understand the world better, and we pursue that new information because it turned out in history that the benefit of finding those things was worth more than the time we lost. And so, as long as we see steady progress, the longer we pursue that new information, the greater the pleasure we eventually feel when we find it. And likewise, if there's a threat to us and we resist it, and deal with all the uncertainty and potential conflict that comes with it, if that threat finally disappears, and it shows that we were correct the whole time, we get a rush of pleasure that is actually scaled to the amount of time that we had to spend fighting or resisting. And so, while movies use small bits of surprise, excitement, or progress to keep our attention, huge parts of their story are built around creating that curiosity, threat, or long-term desire. So we never lose interest, and it can all eventually pay off in that one scene. And we get a perfect emotional high that can last for a very long time.
I found more numbers than anybody else. I went around in a daydream for about 6 weeks.
But anyway, as part of that process, the movie has to ratchet up the tension constantly. The villain has to keep seeming worse and worse. There needs to be a greater risk, and so on. So we get that fresh rush of attention because the situation matters more and more. And as a natural result, that tension has to peak when we finally get to the climax. And that's why you see all the explosions and major moments at the end of the movie. But the funny thing about that is that actually can only feel good for a limited period of time. We can only stay at a maximum emotional level of adrenaline, heart rate, stress, and so on for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we start to get exhausted. This is also why roller coasters and songs tend to only last that long. And when we think about that, we can start to see why movies with 40-minute climaxes tend not to work for us. After that first few minutes, we can't take it. Likewise, we normally are interested in seeing people who are attractive. But the multi-dimensional way that we take in movies leads to bad results when there are too many of those people on screen. On the one hand, they can be so good looking that it's not believable. But beyond that, our minds don't just keep track of the people around us. They also keep track of what those people will think of us. And while it may be great for us to be surrounded by such perfect people, those same perfect people wouldn't want us, with our real flaws, to be around. We wouldn't actually be accepted in a group like that, and so we naturally don't want to accept the world when it's presented to us that way. But by the same token, these movies also make a ton of money. So what gives? Well, it goes back to those earlier parts of the process. When you see a fight, or an explosion, or an attractive person, you get an initial rush of interest, because that might be something that could affect your world or be of value to you. This draws people to go see those movies in the first place. It's only after you process them, or after the explosions go on too long, that any negative feelings may kick in. So it's like having tasty food that makes you sick later. And when we take those things in, we attach those negative emotions to the person we feel caused them. So we blame Michael Bay, or whoever it may be, for exhausting us, making us feel insecure, not paying attention to detail with the movies, lowering the standards of the movie business, or many other things we may feel they did. And we thus react negatively to both the movie and them. But, having said that, not everyone has those feelings. Though the dialogue and acting may not be the best, if you aren't a native speaker of English, you won't notice those things, and you'll be much more likely to see the movie purely for that visual appeal. And if you aren't someone who would be in the peer group of the people on screen, because you're from another country or you're younger than they are, then you won't be threatened if they're too perfect. You can be interested in them for the purposes of learning from them, without feeling the threat of having to fit in. And of course, you can get personal validation if you're a fan of, say, the Transformers and wanted to see them on screen, which may make up for other weaknesses in the storytelling. There's a lot of complexity to how we react to movies. We may buy tickets to one, then say we hate it later, or refuse to see another, think it's terrible, but then hear that it made huge amounts of money from other people. And we can think it's random or a matter of people having bad taste or other things, but there's real reasons why these things happen. And while there may be a lot to it, we can understand them. And hopefully, this was a good example of how those things can work. Thanks for your time. Share the video if you liked it, and I'll be back soon.